implementing multiple sites. Up until this point, we've been talking about the process of implementing Configuration Manager in a single site infrastructure. But in some cases, you may find that that single site infrastructure doesn't do what you need it to do for supporting multiple, maybe network sites or multiple Active Directory structures or multiple just different ways that clients need to contact the Configuration Manager infrastructure. When that's the case, you may want to implement multiple sites. And it is entirely possible with Configuration Manager to implement multiple sites, and you can even connect these sites in a primary secondary format and create tiered sites. These tiered sites allow the sites at the down level layer to input their data or upload their data to servers that are above them in the format. It also allows servers that are above to actually send down things like packages and advertisements and collections down to sites that are below them. And depending on what you're looking for, you may choose to implement primary, secondary, or even a central site to fulfill your needs. And we'll talk about what these different types of site structures are. We'll talk about the process of installing secondary sites as necessary, and that's involved not only with just putting the DVD in the drive of another server, but also from a primary site you can install a secondary site directly from the console. We'll talk about the process of creating senders and addresses to those remote sites. This is the mechanism by which you actually instruct a site to where another site will be. And then we'll also conclude by talking a little bit about branch distribution points, which is a new construct in Configuration Manager 2007. And what branch DPs allow you to do is when you have a very small site that you may not necessarily want to put a whole site server down there, you can actually just put a distribution point in that location. Maybe it's on an existing server, maybe it's even on a workstation down there, so that your packages are actually going to be installed from that local site and not from a distribution point at a remote site. And so let's actually, before we get into the clicky of actually implementing these sites, let's actually look at a picture of how these sites actually work and how they interconnect with each other. You'll see down here that I have a primary site server that I've created down here. There's a little box that's associated with that primary site server. And this box is actually connected to a SQL database here. This SQL database is actually storing the information associated with this primary site. Now, in every case, a primary site is going to have a SQL database associated with it, but down here you'll notice that the secondary site has no SQL database. There's no database whatsoever. And in every case, a secondary site will not have a database associated with it. The idea here is that let's say you have a secondary location that you want to keep all of your data in one location, but you may want a secondary location for a management point or a distribution point or some of the functionality associated with Configuration Manager. Maybe you have a primary site that's where most of your people are and a secondary site where some of your people are, and you just want to keep one database of all the information in one location. Now, the difference between this primary and secondary site is that you can still manage the configuration of the collections and the packages and all those things that you would normally be doing with a primary site. It just replicates down to this secondary site, but you don't want to have a separate data store. Now, that being said, the way that Configuration Manager actually handles multiple sites is that it is also possible to have primary sites that are linked to other primary sites. And so in this other case, let's say I have another primary site here. This second primary site has its own SQL database as well. And so now we actually have the idea where two sites, both of these sites are going to maintain their own SQL information. They're going to maintain their own data store. In this case, just like with the information from the secondary site, anything that is stored here inside of the primary site is going to go flow upwards to the primary site that is a parent to the other primary site. So we have the concept here of parent and child sites. We have the concept of primary and secondary sites. The big difference here, again, is the presence of this SQL database. So you may actually have situations where maybe you have a site that you manage it remotely. You don't want anyone at that local site to be able to create their own elements within Configuration Manager, within the infrastructure. In that case, you may want to install a secondary site. Or maybe up here in your primary site, in the central location, you have your own SQL database, and maybe you have another location where the administrators in that other location, maybe they have their own IT department and they need to have their own local support for collecting data and for creating their collections and those sorts of things. In that case, you may want to create a primary site for them. If throughout the entire process of creating your infrastructure, you can actually go upwards as well. And if you want to connect all of your sites into a single location, we often consider this what we call a central site. And this central site is, in a lot of cases, used for reporting purposes. And so all of the configuration manager infrastructures, all the different servers and sites across an entire large organization can bring their data up into a central location for the process of reporting. Maybe this will help you with a compliance situation. Maybe this will help you with understanding what your patch management situation is across your entire environment. Maybe this will help you understand where your licenses are and what sort of software you have installed across your entire environment. Because all of the sites are going to flow their information up eventually to get to this central site. Again, this is commonly used for reporting, but what this allows you to do is create a hierarchical structure of configuration manager site servers for the purposes of distributing the load, for the purposes of putting each one of these servers in its own perhaps physical network location. Maybe these are separated by physical networks, and so you don't actually have to distribute, for example, packages and those sorts of things over the wide area network. And so Configuration Manager is very rich in its ability to do these linked sites. Now let's actually start by talking about the process of connecting two primary sites together. The process by which you would do this is a little bit different than the process you would use for creating a secondary site, because oftentimes primary sites may be already in place. Maybe you have two separate IT organizations that have created configuration manager servers, and you want to begin linking these servers together so you can create a larger infrastructure across your entire organization. We can actually do that if we minimize here and we go back to our configuration manager console. The process by which we actually take one site and link it to another if they are primary sites is by right-clicking here on the site node here and choosing properties. And you'll see here we have the properties of our site itself, and down here we have a button called Set Parent Site. What this allows us to do is actually create this site as a central site, which is currently set to right now, which means that it is the topmost site in its own hierarchy, or report this site to another parent site somewhere inside of the hierarchy. Now in our case with the little graphic that we've created here, let's say we are looking at this server here, this primary server here, and we want to connect it up to another primary server so that we can create a linkage between the two. We would do that by actually choosing to report to the parent site and then choosing a site that is available for us in the drop-down box. Now we don't have that drop-down box actually created, but we can do this to actually create that linkage to that parent site. Now we'll talk in just a minute about how this box actually gets populated, but this is the process by which that linkage occurs between site to site, and this begins the process of actually connecting those sites together so that their data can be shared. In order for this box to get populated with the site name that we want to actually link this site to, we actually have to create a sender address. And we're going to go ahead and do that now. I'm going to cancel out of this and show you the process of actually creating that sender address. Now again, our box is empty at this point, so we have to actually let it know where the different servers are inside of our organization. And if you'll see here, I've expanded the site settings node, and under addresses, if I right click and choose new, I have the option of choosing a number of different ways of connecting these sites together, of creating a sender address, or creating a location by which we would connect these sites together. I have a standard address, I have an asynchronous RAS, which may mean a type of dial-up. I have a courier, which means I may package up a bunch of data and send it through a courier service through the snail mail, for example. I have an ISDN connection, or an SNA connection, or an X25 connection. Well, the most common of these is the standard sender address, and that's because for sites that are actually connected on the same network and they have the same sort of network connectivity between them, this allows us to create that sort of connection. These other sender addresses require additional elements to be in place. For example, here for asynchronous RAS, we have to have some sort of dial-up in place, or an ISDN in place, or an SNA connection, or an X25 connection. I want to show you how we would create a standard sender address here by clicking on the standard sender address. You'll see here that we need to include a destination site code. If we have one available, it'll actually end up in the drop-down box. You'll see here that our 3-digit site code, 3-character site code, CBN, is currently set for our existing site. Now we can actually put in a different site code here. For example, I don't know, let's say we create a new site called ABC. Whatever that site code is going to be the target location that we are going to attempt to connect to for creating the connection between these sites. In addition to doing this, we also need to give it a name. Maybe it's sccm Nugget 2, for example. And this would be the actual site server name of the target location we're attempting to go to. Maybe we can nuggetlab.com to fully qualify this name. If we need to, we also need to specify a site address account if we don't want to use computer accounts. And what this simply does is allow us to enter in a name and domain/user format for actually making that connection. If we click the next button here, it'll actually give us the option of choosing when we would synchronize data between these two addresses. Maybe we don't want data to be synchronized during the middle part of the day here, and we can remove that part of the day for sending address. Or we can choose, like we've shown here, the availability is open for all priorities, or allowing medium and high priority sorts of elements to occur. If you remember back when we were actually creating advertisements, we were giving those advertisements a priority, and that priority determines when they actually get replicated from site to site. In this case, we'll choose all for open priorities, and this says here, because we've made the entire section in blue, that the replication between site and site is actually not going to be limited at any point in time. I click the next button here, and then we can also choose what sort of rate limits we're going to use when we are doing that synchronization as well. We can choose unlimited when sending if we have a very high level of connectivity between sites, or we can choose pulse mode to limit the type of data that's being pushed from site to site. We can choose a particular size of data block and the delay between data blocks so that we don't actually consume all of the network connectivity between those two sites. We can also limit those to specify maximum transfer rates by hour. So if we have a particular hour range that we want to limit that to, we can actually limit that to a percentage of the available bandwidth. Again, this gives us a pretty rich ability for us to create that connection and rate limit that connection so that we're not going to have a problem with consuming the bandwidth between those connections. If I click the finish button here, you'll see that I now have a standard sender address for this ABC site. It shows here as unknown because there is no ABC site in our infrastructure, but what this allows me to do once I've created the address is actually use this as a location for setting that parent site as necessary. If I go back here to report to parent site, you'll see that my ABC site is an option for me to send that information up. Now you're going to need to be very cautious about creating these connections because if you remember back from the last nuggets, the amount of data that could be collected at any particular site can be substantial, and trying to replicate up that data and all of those statistics can actually consume a lot of the available bandwidth if you have a latent network connection from site to site. So be very cautious when you're creating these sender addresses to rate limit them down so that you don't end up consuming all of the available bandwidth. Now, there are those other types of site structures that are available, or those sender address structures that are available to us if you want to create those as well. We're not necessarily going to talk about those in detail because you don't really, most environments don't necessarily have these sorts of segregated networks where they'll be connecting over RAS lines or ISDN lines. But be aware, especially for the test, that there are ways that if you have disconnected networks that you can use various mechanisms, including courier sender addresses, to actually send data from location to location. So these are available to you, and you will need to know what they are for the test. Now that we've understood the process of connecting primary site to primary site, if we look back at our picture here, we need to have a process also of connecting primary site to secondary site as well. And in this case, we are actually more or less creating kind of a miniature version of a configuration manager server somewhere else inside of our infrastructure, somewhere else inside of our environment. And so the process to do that is not going to be the same because configuration manager is not already installed on both servers. Again, from a primary to primary instance, you actually have to have configuration manager up and running and the SQL-based database up and running and ready to go for that connection to actually occur. When we're creating a secondary site, we're creating more or less a down-level site to assist with the processing of that primary site. There are really two ways that you can go about actually installing a secondary site to an existing server. The first of which is really to drop the DVD media for Configuration Manager into the drive of the available server at the target location and start that installation and install that server as a secondary site. That's pretty common. It's actually very similar to the installation mechanism that we did back in an early nugget of actually installing Configuration Manager onto this server itself. But what's quite a bit more interesting and something that you may need to be aware of is if you click up here on your site node and right click, you can actually choose to create a new secondary site. And what this does is very similar to the process of more or less slipping that DVD in the server and starting the installation process. But what it allows you to do is from this configuration manager server to automatically and remotely install the secondary site stuff, the bits, onto that destination server. And this is actually good, especially if that server has perhaps a high network connectivity connectivity between you at the primary site and it at the secondary site, and it may be in a remote location, so you don't necessarily have the ability to easily put the DVD in the drive of that server. What this allows us to do is remotely install Configuration Manager. In this case, if we're going to create a new secondary site, we need to give it a site identity. Again, all of the site codes, and we've said this again and again and again, but all of the site codes across all of your sites in the entire organization must be unique, and there can be a major problem if you have any site codes that ever have the same 3-digit site code. So be very, very aware that you don't share those site codes. Let's say we're creating a secondary site called CB2, for example, and we give it a site name called CBT Nuggets Site 2. That actually gives us a secondary site individual site code that is available for us for this site, and as well as the new site name as well. I can choose the next here, and I can choose the site server that I want. Maybe it's sccm nugget2.nuggetlab, there. And the installation directory would be, C program files, for example, program files, and then Microsoft Configuration Manager. Might be a location that we want to install the source files to. If we click the next button here, we can choose where do we want to the source files to arrive to. Do we want to copy those installation source files over the network from this local site server, or do we want to install them over the network? Much in the same way that you would work with your packages, you can actually copy that files down before you begin the installation. If you have network latency conditions where the network may have some problems from time to time, you may want to copy those files down first using the bits protocol so that they're ensured and they're on that remote server before you begin the process. We can choose an address to a secondary site. If we have a secondary site available to us, we can choose that address for the secondary site. Or we can create a new address if necessary. If we choose the next button here, this allows us the ability to create perhaps another standard sender address with a secondary site server name. Once we complete there, then we choose the new address of the site, create the summary process, and actually complete the process of installing the bits down to that secondary site. And we're not going to do this at this point. We're not going to go through that process because that can take an extended period of time. But what I want to show you here is the process of installing that secondary site remotely is very, very easy. All you need to do is complete these processes, and what you create now is that slave site that actually sits below your primary site and handles the management of clients, the distribution of policy, the management point, any distribution sorts of activities, those sorts of things that are necessary to successfully extend your configuration manager network from one place to another. The last topic that we want to talk about in this nugget has to do with branch distribution points. And if we go back to our little picture here for just a second, there may be some situations where you may find that the functionality of a full secondary site may be even more than what you really want. You may have some situations in your environment where you may have a very small site, maybe just a couple of computers, maybe 10 computers or 50 computers in one location that's not really large enough for an entire secondary site server, but you do want to have a place where you can store perhaps the files that would be used for distributing software. You may not even have a server there. You may have just a little workstation that sits in that little site there, and that workstation may be a particularly powerful workstation, and it may have some extra resources. In that case, we can actually create what is called a branch distribution point. And I'm going to put a little link here over to this workstation. And what this branch distribution point allows us to do is not necessarily the full functionality of a secondary site, which involves cost, because you have to buy the server license, which involves the cost for the server itself, but really a small location where you're going to put some files that would otherwise need to be distributed onto perhaps a workstation or a server that sits in that location so that they're available for the computers that are in that remote site. Again, the idea here is that by creating that location, you can very easily distribute the files to those computers without having to worry about saturating your network links or really be concerned about the network traffic being going back and forth between the target site and the source site. We can actually create a branch distribution point by going here under Site Systems and identifying a new server that may be a potential candidate for being a site system. The branch distribution point, the code that actually processes branch distribution point is native to the Configuration Manager client. So any client has the ability to be a branch distribution point. In our case, Nugget 1 is one of those clients. Nugget 1 is a Windows XP machine. It's not a server of any kind. And if we put in Nugget 1 here and then fully qualify it with Nugget 1 sccm.nuggetlab.com, we can actually make Nugget 1 a distribution point. I'm going to click Next here, and you'll see that now we have the option of choosing it as a standard distribution point or as a branch distribution point. And again, this is not the full support of all the things you would normally think of as a distribution point. It allows you to more or less pre-stage those files onto that location, so you don't have to then send them over the network whenever you're multiple times whenever you're sending out an advertisements to the machines in that location. We can use a specific partition that may be available on that machine, maybe A, C, D, for example, that is available on that machine, and then we can reserve a certain amount of space for the operating system itself, so we don't necessarily consume all of the available space on that machine. Once we've done that, we actually, in the background, go through the process of creating that branch distribution point on that local machine. Now, for the most part, creating that branch distribution point really isn't much more than more or less creating a file share, more or less, on that machine. And that file share has some additional functionality that's used by the configuration manager client for the purposes of distributing out software as the advertisements occur. Now, if you remember, there is one setting when you're creating packages that deals with branch distribution points. Under software distribution and packages, if we actually look at one of the packages, again, back to this Adobe Acrobat package we've looked at so often, if we go look at properties again and then look back up at distribution settings, we actually have some selections we can make for each of our packages and how they are dealt with when it comes to branch distribution points. You'll see here that by default we are automatically downloading the content when packages are assigned to branch distribution points. Alternatively, we can choose to manually copy that package down to a branch distribution point, perhaps if we want to wait and do that at a later time, for example. Or we can enable a sort of on-demand download for clients that are inside protected boundaries by checking this box. What this says is that we make the package available on those protected distribution points, if they are branch distribution points, when they're requested by those clients. And so there are some specific settings you're going to have here inside of each individual package if you want to change from the default, which is to automatically download. Again, the idea here is that we can use these various constructs that are made up of our various site hierarchy to assist us when we have problems, for example, with network conditions, when we have multiple administrators or multiple administrative teams that are working together for the purposes of administering the configuration manager infrastructure and all the servers and workstations in the environment. And so in this nugget, we've talked about that process of implementing multiple sites. We've talked about the primary and the secondary and even using central sites and the different ways that you can move those around on top of each other to create a site hierarchy. We talked about the process of installing not only primary and secondary sites, but also how to install them remotely over the internet or over the network if necessary. We talked about centers and addresses and also the process of installing branch distribution points if you don't necessarily need that secondary site, but you just need a location in a remote site for storing files so that clients can get their packages whenever they're necessary. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.